Let's go ahead and begin with some reading. I'm going to just start reading in verse 1. And just read chapter 7. Okay, so let's begin with going to the text here, as I'm about to lose all my notes. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, starting with verse 1. Paul writes, "Therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all defilement of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Make room for us in your hearts. We wronged no one. We corrupted no one. We took advantage of no one. I do not speak to condemn you, for I have said before that you are in our hearts, to die together and to live together. Great is my confidence in you. Great is my boasting on your behalf. I am filled with comfort. I am overflowing with joy in all our affliction. For even when we came into Macedonia, our flesh had no rest, but we were afflicted on every side, conflicts without, fears within. But God, who comforts the depressed, comforted us by the coming of Titus, and not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted in you, as he reported to us your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced even more. For though I caused you sorrow by my letter, I do not regret it. Though I did regret it, for I see that the letter caused you sorrow, though only for a little while, I now rejoice. Not that you were made sorrowful, but that you were made sorrowful to the point of repentance. For you were made sorrowful according to the will of God, so that you might not suffer loss in anything through us. For the sorrow that is according to the will of God produces a repentance without regret, leading to salvation, but the sorrow of the world produces death. For behold, what earnestness this very thing, this godly sorrow, has produced in you. What vindication of yourselves, what indignation, what fear, what longing, what zeal, what avenging of wrong. In everything you demonstrated yourselves to be innocent in the matter. So, although I wrote to you, it was not for the sake of the offender, nor for the sake of the one offended, but that your earnestness on our behalf might be made known to you in the sight of God. For this reason, we have been comforted. And besides our comfort, we rejoiced even much more for the joy of Titus, because his spirit has been refreshed by you all. For if in anything I have boasted to him about you, I was not put to shame, but as we spoke all things to you in truth, so also our boasting before Titus proved to be the truth. His affection abounds all the more toward you, as he remembers the obedience of you all, how you received him with fear and trembling. I rejoice that in everything I have confidence in you." Okay. As you look at the beginning of chapter 1, you can see, or chapter 7, you can see that in verse 1, it really continues the thoughts from chapter 6. So that's where I want to begin. Yes, you know me, we're going to get a running start into chapter 7, so I want to touch ever so briefly on some of the salient points from chapter 6. So in chapter 6, these were some of the things that Paul had to say to them. He says, do not receive God's grace in vain. Contextually, I believe he's referring there to these teachers who are accusing Paul, disparaging Paul, trying, big picture, to tear down the ministry of Paul. And for Paul, it wasn't about him nearly as much as it was about the gospel. And by tearing down the gospel, now this has become a very serious matter. It's not about Paul. For them to embrace these teachers and reject the apostle is to reject God and his saving message. And were they to do that, then indeed, all that God would have accomplished among them could be looked at as being in vain. Paul, for his part, has not received God's grace in vain. And again, we've emphasized this. Paul is very transparent in this letter, isn't he? He's very vulnerable. He's very open. In fact, you heard some of that language in what we just read. In chapter 6 and 7, that language of openness. Open our heart. Corinthians, open your heart. Paul's an open book. Throughout this letter, he has affirmed everything that we have done openly, we have done in all sincerity. Examine the evidence for yourself as look, he's happy to be examined, happy to have his work be examined. He answers to the Lord. He's not afraid of that. But it's clear Paul is not about building his own brand, is he? He's not about that. He's about advancing the gospel. He's commending himself only as a servant of God, chapter 6 and verse 3. I think it is. Chapter 6 and verse 4, rather. But in everything, commending ourselves as servants of God. And we talked about that. And all of the various evidences of his ministry and the things he suffered, the fruits of the Spirit, the response to his message all serve as evidence that he indeed is a servant of God. And so he says, we're open to you. And yet there's this, for all of the good news that he's clearly happy about, there's still some tension there, isn't there? It's palpable when you read the letter. And he gets right down to brass tacks. He says, let me help you identify what that barrier is connected with. It's connected with your own affections. There's a barrier there. It is not because I want there to be one. And I want to stop and pause and note for all of us just what an important affirmation that is when we are in conflict with someone. When we're in conflict with someone, how vital is it that we affirm openly, out loud, what probably everybody involved wants to see happen? We think, well, why would that be important? Why state the obvious? Listen, that can be a very powerful thing. To affirm our love for one another, chapter 2, he speaks of that. But to affirm our mutual purpose as disciples, how we all want to see this turn out. And I see Paul doing some of that here. Open your hearts to us. Our hearts are open to you. We are in this for your eternal good. He just keeps repeating that over and over and over again. Which sometimes if you get some, and if you've been upset with someone and have been so upset that you can't see straight, you know that from experience that it may take that affirmation over and over to finally get you to wake up and say, oh, they're not as bad a person as I had made them out to be in my mind. And that can go both ways. So he's affirming the positive. Paul is all about achieving unity with them. We are open to you. The barrier, he's very honest about that, is your affections. He says, do not be bound together with unbelievers. Now, there's a broader principle there that we sometimes will discuss as it may pertain, say, to marriage, certainly, but contextually here, the application is to the influence of these teachers, and we need to see that and appreciate that. Being connected with these teachers is, what happens? We should have some of our brothers and sisters that work with animals all the time wax eloquent about this, but in general, if you try to yoke two animals together that really don't belong together, how's that going to turn out? Right? It may end up hurting both of them. One of them invariably will have to do more work than the other. They'll be missing that cadence or that harmony or that, synergy that those two animals really need to have together. None of that will be there. And it could just be a bad thing all the way around. Well, there's a limited analogy, right, between that image and their association with these teachers. Nothing good can come from it. It will hurt you. And he's not shy about stating these are the stakes. This is very important. So he appeals to them on the basis of evidence. He appeals to them on the basis of, my heart is open to you. I want to have unity with you. He's appealed to them on the basis of this principle of how being bound with them will hurt them. And then he now appeals to them at the end of chapter 6 and appeals to their fear of God, their respect and reverence for God. He cites some very powerful promises about God calling us out and him being our God and we being his people. What a beautiful description of harmony and a fellowship. That it's a beautiful picture of what God desires for his people to have with him collectively in Christ. But what's going on in the Corinthian church is threatening all of that. What they need to do is to get their thinking clarified, get their eyes back on Jesus, get their hearts focused on the promises of God, and once again, with perhaps the same ardor that they used to, once again pursue holiness. And we'll talk later about the connection between holiness and unity. Holiness and being open-hearted toward one another. But that's the flow of thought as he comes in here. He's calling for reconciliation. He's calling to listen to him as an ambassador of Jesus Christ. What's happening? However, bad influences among the church can be an insidious force for destruction that we often underestimate. And Paul sees it for what it is, and perhaps the spirit of the late Barney Fife wants to nip it in the bud just a bit. But this is not Paul overreacting. This is Paul responding in a very measured way to a very real and present threat within the church. Okay, so as we begin chapter 7 then, and look further into this, given those things in mind, we pivot now to what he says in verses 2 and 3, where once again he makes this appeal for openness, for connection, for a restoration of perhaps a place that they enjoyed in their relationship that maybe is suffering now. Verse 2 seems to allude to, it could be just my read on it, allude to some accusations that perhaps were going around about Paul. Do you kind of see that in the language of verse 2? When Paul says, we wronged no one, we corrupted no one, we took advantage of no one. I wouldn't be dogmatic about that, but it would seem certainly that perhaps that was part of the thing that was going around being said about Paul. Paul's willing to be examined on all of those points. And as if to say, hey, check it out for yourself. Look at the record. We've done no such thing. Thoughts about that? Maybe you have a different slant, a look at about the passage. Okay? Well, so he says, make room for us in your hearts. We wronged no one, corrupted no one. We took advantage of no one. And Paul's motivation for even going there, he's not taking the posture here of flashing his badge, flexing his authority, and in that way, seeking necessarily to condemn. He has a different motive for saying this. I mean, he could flex his authority as an apostle. But here, I think as a measure of his gentleness, he's coming at this from a different motivation. Again, he's trying to emphasize his desire, even as he's saying, make room for us in your hearts. he's providing evidence that his heart is fully open to them. I mean, how else could you say it? I have said before that you are in our hearts to die together. I don't know about you, that sounds committed. And given the descriptions of Paul's sufferings in this letter alone, those aren't empty words. Paul is willing, he would say later, to spend and be spent for their sakes. All things are for your sake, even to the point of death, to die together. And then subsequently, not just die together in suffering for the faith, but further to what together? Live. Paul's looking past the suffering, which sometimes we struggle to do. He sees well past the dying and the suffering to see the renewal, to see eternal life. And frankly, these Corinthians probably have become a bit myopic themselves. So he's enlarging their thinking, getting their eyes back on the prize, seeking to, again, just appeal to them. Cole's got a comment over here.
I do kind of agree with what you said about, maybe him having to defend himself. But just that also was making me think about, like, this passage right here. Great confidence is in you. Great is my boasting on your behalf. I'm filled with comfort. I'm overflowing with joy in all your affliction. I feel like a lot of times, like, I don't do this enough, and I know this for myself. I feel like or just in the church in general, we do a lot of times where we correct people, but we don't ever tell them when they're doing.
We do what?
We do a lot of things when we correct people.
Okay.
We correct people a lot of times. Like, hey, you're not doing this right. You need to do this right. You need to do this better. But how many times do we tell them that they're doing a good job? And I feel like we should be telling people a whole lot more that they're doing a good job. And I think Paul does a good job about that. They're doing a good job. And I think a lot of times we don't do that because, at least from my perspective, some people feel uncomfortable when they're acknowledged, but I still think we need to make sure that we're encouraging our brothers and sisters so when the time comes, you haven't just cashed out this, like you've never put in any credit, you just taking debits all the time.
We've got to make some deposits.
Right. Yeah, deposits. That's a better way to put it. I just think here he's doing that, and I think he's also kind of affirming to them, like, people know that I speak this way about you. So it's not just to that individual, but it's like, I don't go to other churches and tell them that Twin City's horrible. Everyone
even
knows
if you thought so, right?
Yeah, even if there's some things that are wrong.
Which you don't.
Yeah. And I think this is something I know I need to work on about.
Me too.
Because I can be overly critical a lot of the times where I'm like super critical of things and I want to, it can be a good thing at times, but if you don't show like that you are grateful for what things have been or take acknowledgement, it can seem that you just don't. You're just always being manipulative. Or I think that's why he says those first few things is it's like kind of trying to defend himself that he's like, yeah, I'm not trying to be manipulative or, so anyways.
Look, I'm just going to go right there. I mean, you stole my thunder, but fact is you said that way better than I was going to. I think you're exactly right, Cole. How would people say this today? Paul is putting on a master class. Right, because we pray, we seek prayerfully to always find the right balance in dealing with one another, right? You ever second guess yourself after an interaction? Either I was too harsh, I was too lenient. If you're like me and always second guessing self, it's obviously forgetting that the power's not in me, right? It's in God. But we really want to get that right. But it's good that we have an awareness that we're limited and we've got to rely more on God. And I think what you're advocating and what Paul practices here is really a step of faith. He's not flattering them. I hope that none of us see what he's engaged in here as flattery, which could be a nice way of saying just lying to them. He's being genuine. I'm struck, to the point you made, that look at all of the positive things he notes here as he affirms the positive. Just in verse 4, great is my confidence. You can just shout it out here. Great is my confidence, or whatever word's there, and great is my pride. Mine says boasting. I am filled with encouragement. Mine says comfort. Somebody have a different rendering? I am overflowing. It's almost like it just gets even bigger. I'm overflowing with joy. I've said they're picturing Paul writing this and maybe even pausing just to thank God for them. You realize he's saying all of this to the Corinthian church, right? He over and over, and we've just noted 4 times in one verse how he finds a way to why is that so important in helping to restore someone's thinking? Why is it helpful to you when someone takes that tactic with you? Peggy? Here's a mic. Sorry. Say that again so everybody can hear it.
It grabs their attention.
Yeah.
They perceive from what you are saying to them, when you're saying it with true meaning and feeling and exuding that to them, it gets their attention. In the 6th chapter, the 12th verse, it says, we are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us. So Paul is using that tactic to help them or to get them to listen to him.
Right.
Because he wants to help them.
He's not at all. All of this praise in 7:4 helps show them he's not trying to be unfair. He's not trying to be hard to get along with here and unreasonable. He wants to look at this truthfully and with unbiased eyes. That's all that anyone can ask for, right? Is a fair hearing. He's giving them that. Dick?
He's spoken down to them, correcting to them in a number of ways. Here, with this, congratulations, he restores their self-worth, their self-value.
Restores that's all part of restoration, is reaffirming their value to him, but ultimately to God and to themselves. Cole?
To me, a big thing about this type of conversation that you have with somebody is you have to respect them and they have to respect you. Because if they don't respect you, you correcting them and saying anything means absolutely nothing.
Right.
So I feel like Paul is trying to genuinely show them that I genuinely respect you. And these are the things I respect about you. And I think it's important to try to develop that with people you love. And obviously that comes in different ways, but that's done by actions or whatever, And I think Paul does a good job about trying to generate that between his brothers and sisters, that he knows and he loves and respects them, and they feel the same way about him.
Very good. Drew's got a comment. I'll just observe while the mic's going back to him. I once read a book on praise, and one of the recurring lines, I couldn't tell you everything. That's been so long ago I read it. But this line sticks with me to this day about praise. The author just repeating this idea of, how will you know unless I tell you? And that idea of verbalizing praise can be so important. True?
I don't want to steal your thunder because we
away.
haven't quite gotten there yet. But
Go ahead.
The thing that he's specifically praising them for is the way that they have handled his confrontation and the way that they have repented and changed and handled, hey, I have sin in my life, there's a shortcoming, and I'm going to handle it completely maturely and with humility, and that promotes zeal. And the type of relationship that Paul can have to call out sin and then watch that be changed and see the growth in that and then be so excited for them is a beautiful template for what our own relationships need to look like. And so
I like the word template.
It's just awesome that this is what he's so excited about for them is, hey, this is how you dealt with sin in your life. Like, this is discipleship in a master class, is what you were saying.
Yeah. I mean, he's not praising them in something small where you think, oh, you're just saying that. To know in this matter here, this really big thing, you responded just the way God would want you to. I can't say I've always kept that principle in mind in the midst of a tough situation, but it is an indispensable part of restoring a brother or sister who's fallen into not just the reaffirmation of love, which he talks about earlier in the epistle, but I mean, to emphasize the things that are being done right in no way minimizes the wrong. Both are needed. But if you're hyper-focused on one to the neglect of the other, either way, it's just not going to turn out as well. So this idea of having balanced, measured thinking, being circumspect, and really just being fair and completely open with them. It's another measure of Paul's openness. He sees the whole picture here. Sees the bad, and isn't that representative of God? Who sees the whole picture better than God? So Paul is really serving as an ambassador. He is looking and regarding this through the eyes of God, isn't he? And God's not shy about commending the good. He sees the good and the bad. So, I entitled this, Great is My Confidence. It's like bookends here. In verse 4, he expresses his confidence. The end of the chapter, verse 16, he expresses that confidence as well. Again, he says, look, I am filled with so much comfort about you. I am feeling such joy, experiencing such joy. And it's Corinthians, it makes all of the affliction worth it. And so then he goes back and replays some of that for them, but in the vein of, hey, this is all worth it. God has comforted us, and he's comforted us through you. He comforted us, verse 6, by the coming of Titus. I'm sure it was comforting just to see him again. I mean, earlier he said, we had no rest, not finding Titus our brother. So they were comforted when they finally caught up with Titus, but further by the message that he shared with them about them, the report, verse 7, that they received about them. And so that only magnifies the rejoicing and comfort further. And so then, beginning with verse 8, he begins to reflect a little bit. Because there's an elephant in the room, maybe more than one with this conflict here. And that is this letter that he wrote, that I believe we know of as 1 Corinthians. Not a pleasant letter to have received. None of us would relish, at first reading, the things that Paul would have to say. So that's back to your point. Well, I think probably he tilts far, Dick, toward the end of correction in that letter. Probably doesn't get to the subject he really wants to address, the resurrection, until chapter 15, because he has so many other things. They're so carnal and So anyway, so now, as he reflects on that, he even now, and he picks the right time to do this. Hopefully, as they're reading and nodding their head at the things that he's saying and finding their hearts beginning again to align with his, now they can really talk meaningfully about this difficulty that has been between them, this letter. Even though it engendered a great response, right? The report Titus gives is a good one, but it was still hurtful. And so Paul opens up about his feelings about that. Listen, I want you to know, when I wrote those hard things, and this is also informative to us, that we open up and says, listen, I had to say something really hard to you. I just so that you aren't left guessing, I want you to know what I was thinking when I said that. Think that could be important? As we may be at odds with one another, is just to open up and be vulnerable about that and say, listen, whatever it is, I was having doubts about how to handle this, or here's what I was thinking, I felt certain about this, that, or the other. But that's what Paul's doing here. He says, I realize, I understand I caused you sorrow. But he wants them to know he doesn't relish that through he may only relish it through a certain lens, but he wants to clarify what he means by that. There was a part of him that at one point did regret writing the letter, just on a friendship basis. But in the big picture, he can't be too sorry about this because of the result that it produced. Relatively speaking, the sorrow that they experienced was, number one, only for a time, and number two, produced an eternally significant outcome, a positive outcome. Verse 9, I now rejoice not that you were made sorrowful, but that you were made sorrowful to the point of repentance. Again, he's looking at all of this through the eyes of God. He's trying to get them to see all of this through the eyes of God. You were made sorrowful according to the will of God. Again, he continues, he's functioning here as a servant. He's deferring to God always, so that you might not suffer loss in anything through us. And then he speaks about godly sorrow versus worldly sorrow. There's such a contrast between those. And then verse 11, he just, I like verse 11 because of how it's clear he has thought about the response. Sorry, I've been kind of looking down here. Trish, go ahead. Sorry, sister.
Oh, that's okay. Most of the people in this room with gray hair will remember what I'm going to mention. When I was growing up, the phrase, this hurts me more than it hurts you, was very prevalent. And when we got in trouble, we got the talk first, and then the punishment. And then we were left to kind of stew in it. Because when my kids came along, my mother used to always tell me, after you've punished them, you don't go and love on them, because then that undoes the punishment. And I never went along with that. I mean, I didn't just immediately whop them and then put them in my arms, but they needed that comfort to reestablish their feelings about themselves. And I think it's hard for anyone to criticize or point out mistakes that someone's made. That's an uncomfortable position to be in, with the best of intentions.
Yeah.
And I can see where he would regret it, but the outcome was what he wanted them to do.
Yeah.
But I was up in years before I understood this hurts me more than it hurts you. Because it didn't seem so at the time.
Yeah, I never liked hearing that when I was on the receiving end. Well, I'll just say this about that, and then a comment here on 11 and 12. Wise woman years ago told us the punishment has to fit the crime, it has to fit the child. And Paul has given them some time to stew in it just a bit. I don't know how many weeks or months have transpired here. There's wisdom and godly judgment to be exercised in those things. And you make a good point. probably not a one size fits all when it comes to kids. The general principles certainly we embrace. Sometimes the application, yeah. Sometimes the child does need that affirmation sooner than maybe another one might need to sit in it for a little bit. Depends on how hard-headed they are. Look at verse 11. I see verse 11 as indicating that Paul has really spent a lot of time thinking about their response. He doesn't just say you did the right thing. He has noted, Cole, back to your point. He's very observant here at the different ways that the gospel has produced the desired fruit here. This godly sorrow has produced vindication of themselves, indignation, fear, longing, zeal, avenging of wrong, all of which are important in their own way. But again, it's a very full consideration of the results here. It indicates certainly the volume of this is just also in its own way conveying to the Corinthians, hey, you really let the word go deeply in your heart. Look at all the fruit it produced. And really, that's kind of why he does it, because in verse 12, he's not saying this necessarily for the sake of the people initially involved, although those are important people too. But here, it seems that his focus in all of this is to help them see their earnestness. They have been really heartfelt and earnest in their response. And he wants that to be made known to them. He wants them to see that in the sight of God. That's how I read verse 12. And for Paul, verse 13, that is a very comforting thought. Okay? Scott.
When I think about this section, when someone comes to you and talks to you and has to tell you hard things, we can react in two ways, right? We get defensive and start lashing back.
Yeah.
Or the other way is we can carefully consider the things that they have to say, knowing that it's very hard for them to come and talk to me about these things and then examine them. It may not be true, but you can examine them and then make whatever course correction you need to in your life. Most time when people come to talk to you about hard things, I think their motive is good, because it's really hard to do that. Sometimes people come with bad motives, but still, for the most part, they're good. And when I look at this section, I think Paul came to them to tell them hard things, and they actually considered it. And then they repented and they changed their life. And Paul is thankful and comforted by that. And now they have an enthusiasm for Paul, and that often happens when someone is a true friend and come and tells us hard things, and we examine that. Our relationship is often even better after that. And so I kind of see that's what's going on. It's just something for us to consider. I mean, when somebody has to talk to us about hard things, we just need to take a step back and say, all right, let me think about this and try to wrap my arms around it and figure this out. And if I need to make changes, make changes. But this is what you hope would happen. But what often happens, and I grew up in a city where we had numerous churches. Often happen, people get upset and leave. Yeah, and that's.
Show me where that's okay.
Yeah, that's not in either of the epistles of Corinthians. But the point being is we just need to realize how hard it is. Someone comes say something to us, and we at least before we dismiss it, we ought to carefully consider it.
Yeah, so true. Just the way that everybody's helping each other here get through this, and being circumspect in their thinking. A point not to be missed in this is the space he devotes to just helping them appreciate, whether they realize it or not, how much they've helped Titus. Boy, do we need men and women like Titus among us. What an indispensable servant Titus was. That's a separate discussion. But he opens his heart here about Titus. Besides our comfort, so he's explained why they're comforted in their response, but beyond that, further magnifying their joy and comfort is what all of this has done for Titus. Titus has just, in this scenario, kind of been the messenger, right? The one assigned to go and check on them. We use that expression, don't shoot the messenger. Thankfully, that did not happen here. They blessed the messenger. They sent the messenger away with a full heart. They've encouraged the messenger. And I find Paul, he's leaving no stone unturned to try to restore them and help them to see, hey, this response to the letter, it's as if to say to them, this is what we need more of. So that when he has to say other hard things, and when you come to chapter 10, oh baby, the heat's going to get turned up. He's laying the groundwork for that here. So that he'll be able to once again say some difficult things, particularly to his accusers. But they're not going to be able to accuse him of not caring and not seeing the good, right? He's cutting all of those arguments off at the knees right now with his treatment of this. So there's the discussion about his refreshment of spirit, his affection, verse 15, his remembrance of their obedience. He's just, at every point, Paul's just saying, verse 16, I'm just so happy that in everything I have confidence in you. It's just, Paul is so elated. And he tells them so. Okay, so we've discussed quite a bit of this already, but I'll just have these up here. I think this whole context certainly helps us appreciate the connection between holiness and openness among us, where we can be transparent and honest and vulnerable. Holiness creates alignment of hearts among brethren. If you have some brethren who are pursuing holiness and others that aren't, you ever have some disciples and just never could have a deep spiritual discussion with them? Because beyond the name Christian, you really just don't have that much in common. That sounds harsh. But if you've experienced that, you know what I'm talking about. There are sorrows and regrets worth having versus not worth having. Leaving things unsaid would probably go in the category of regrets not worth having. Let's prayerfully figure out how to say to each other that whatever is needful, whatever will build up. The importance of constructive confrontation. Boy, this has really been a good study in that. The power of shared comfort and joy. Do you see it? That they're all rejoicing in something together. What momentum that generates among God's people. And then why it is so vital we have men and women like Titus. So I actually put a point up there about that. Are we out of time? Oh, okay. Ask a question, get it answered. Okay, for now, the study guide for next week is online. I will try in the next day or so to be more successful about producing some copies that if you just need one, you could print it out. I'll try and just email the file as well to everybody so you can